You hear the silk before you see it. White silk unspooling in the hands of eunuchs who won't meet your eyes. Your hands are bound, not with rope, but with ceremonial cord, the kind reserved for imperial gifts. You're 16, maybe 17. You came here in a sealed carriage 3 years ago. You survived the selection. You survived the training. You survived the night 2,800 women didn't. And now they're telling you this is an honor. The white silk waits. The eunuch's hands are steady. Yours are not. This is how it ends for the chosen ones. Not in violence, but in ceremony. Not with screaming, but with music playing softly in the courtyard outside. They call it accompanying the emperor into eternity. You call it nothing anymore because the girl who had words, who had a name her mother spoke with love, died the day the palace gates closed behind her. Her name appears in exactly 3 documents. Consort Han, tribute woman, Korean registry number 47. The Ming dynasty records list her entry date as 1408. Her death date is 1424, and between those 2 numbers, nothing. 16 years compressed into 2 dates and a single word, deceased. What the official records don't mention is how she died or why. What they carefully omit is that she was one of dozens selected for eternal honor when Emperor Yongle closed his eyes for the last time. The practice had a name, Zanzang, accompanying burial, and it had been happening for over 1,500 years before Han's white silk moment, refined and perfected with each dynasty until it became a machine that consumed young women and left behind only bureaucratic notes about funeral expenses and silk requisitions. The system that brought Han to that moment didn't start with her and wouldn't end with her. It started centuries before, built on a foundation most people never question when they imagine the golden age of imperial China. When tourists walk through the Forbidden City today, they see architectural genius. They see the vermilion walls and golden roof tiles. They see power frozen in stone and wood. What they don't see, what the plaques and guided tours carefully avoid, are the buildings in the far northern section, the ones closed to visitors, the ones whose windows face interior courtyards no cameras are allowed to capture. Those were the working buildings of a system that ran for 2,000 years and processed over 100,000 women through its corridors, and most of them never left. Before we go any deeper into what happened in those final moments, drop a comment and let me know what part of the world you're watching from. It genuinely amazes me that a story this buried, this deliberately erased, can somehow find its way to every corner of the planet centuries later. The selection process had an elegant name, Shunyu selection. It sounds almost voluntary, like an audition or a scholarship program. But the mechanics tell a different story. Every 3 years during the Ming dynasty, imperial commissioners fanned out across the provinces with lists. Every unmarried girl between 13 and 16 had to be presented. Not invited, not requested. Presented. Families who hid daughters faced execution, not just of the father but of the extended household, sometimes the entire village, if officials decided to make an example. The inspection happened in stages, each one designed to narrow the field and break resistance. First, physical examination. Palace physicians checked for scars, birthmarks, asymmetry. They measured proportions with calipers. They examined teeth, hair, fingernails. One manual from the Qing dynasty lists 43 specific disqualifying traits, including a mole above the left eyebrow, uneven earlobes, and laughter that showed too much gum. The girls who passed moved to the second round, which evaluated walk, voice, posture, and what the documents call essence, a term never clearly defined but apparently measurable by eunuchs trained specifically for this purpose. Those who passed both rounds were taken. Families received compensation, usually a small stipend of silver, and a certificate declaring their daughter had entered imperial service. The certificate came with an unspoken threat. Accepting the payment meant acknowledging the transaction. Refusing it meant rejecting imperial generosity, which was legally indistinguishable from treason. Most families took the silver. Some held funerals immediately, even though their daughters were still alive and traveling toward the capital in sealed carriages. They understood something the outside world didn't. The girl who left was already gone. The person who might return, if she ever returned, wouldn't be their daughter anymore. Han arrived as part of a different channel. Korea sent women to the Ming court as diplomatic tribute, part of the complex relationship between a powerful empire and a smaller neighboring kingdom trying to avoid invasion. Between 1408 and 1435, over 100 Korean women made that journey. The records are specific about numbers, but vague about names. Han appears because she lived long enough to matter, briefly, in one bureaucratic footnote. The others exist only as tally marks in shipping manifests, listed between bolts of silk and ceramic jars. When Han's carriage reached the outer gates of the Forbidden City, she had already been traveling for 7 weeks. The journey protocol was explicit. Sealed carriage, no windows, no conversation between the girls, minimal food and water to reduce the need for stops. One girl in Han's group tried to escape during a rest period. The guards brought her back with her hand crushed between 2 stones. She died of infection 4 days later. Her body was left at the roadside. The carriage continued. The lesson was absorbed by the survivors without a single word being spoken. The moment the gates closed behind them, a different process began. Refinement, the eunuchs called it, though the Ming Dynasty training manuals use a more clinical term that translates roughly as essence adjustment. The girls were separated into groups of 20 and taken to dormitory buildings in the service quarters of the palace complex. The first thing they did was cut the girls' hair, a profound dishonor in Chinese and Korean culture, a visible mark of shame usually reserved for criminals. The second thing was replace their names with numbers. Han became Tribute 47. The third thing was isolation. No letters home, no news from outside, no contact with anyone except the training eunuchs and the senior concubines assigned to teach them the 47 rules of standing, the 23 approved methods of bowing, the 6 acceptable voice tones for responding to imperial questions. The training lasted between 6 months and 2 years, depending on how quickly the girl demonstrated full compliance. Compliance had specific observable markers: walking without sound, keeping eyes lowered for hours without blinking, smiling on command, maintaining the smile while being struck with bamboo rods, because the emperor must never see distress on a concubine's face even if she's in pain. The girls practiced 8 hours a day. They woke before dawn. They slept after midnight. The exhaustion wasn't accidental. Sleep deprivation breaks resistance faster than physical punishment and leaves no visible scars. Some girls broke early and were sent to servant positions. Some never broke and disappeared from the records entirely, their fate unwritten but easy to guess. the ones who broke at exactly the right pace, who learned to perform submission while retaining enough personality to be interesting. Those were the ones who moved forward into the formal hierarchy. The hierarchy had 8 official ranks during the Ming dynasty, though the actual structure was more complex with sub-ranks and temporary titles. At the top, the empress, the only woman whose marriage to the emperor had legal standing. Below her, imperial consorts, usually 4 at any time, each managing a section of the palace complex. Then high-ranking concubines, mid-ranking concubines, low-ranking concubines, and at the bottom, preparatory women, girls whose position hadn't been finalized. Han entered as preparatory woman number 47 and stayed there for 3 years before being elevated to low-ranking concubine, a promotion that came with a private room barely larger than a closet, and an increase in daily meat ration from 3 ounces to 5. Rank determined everything: the color of your clothing, the material of your shoes, the number of servants you were allowed, the type of dishes you ate from. High-ranking concubines ate from porcelain painted with dragons. Low-ranking concubines ate from plain ceramic. Preparatory women ate from wooden bowls. They had to wash themselves. The food itself followed strict hierarchy. The empress received 22 pounds of premium meat daily, though she rarely ate even a fraction of it. The excess was distributed downward through the ranks, but by the time it reached the bottom levels, corruption had siphoned off most of it. Eunuchs skimmed. Senior concubines hoarded. Low-ranking concubines often received less than 4 ounces of meat per day, and whatever vegetables the kitchen had left over. Malnutrition was common at the lower ranks. Women's teeth fell out. Their hair thinned. They aged decades and years. And the cruel logic of the system meant that declining appearance made them even less likely to be summoned by the emperor, which meant they would never rise in rank, which meant their rations would never improve. It was a spiral built into the architecture. The emperor didn't visit concubines. They were summoned. Every evening, a senior eunuch presented the emperor with wooden tablets bearing names and small painted portraits of available women. The emperor pointed to one. Sometimes he chose based on the portrait, sometimes based on advice from senior eunuchs who had their own political interests in which women gained favor. Sometimes he simply pointed at random. Once chosen, the ritual began with mechanical precision. The concubine was taken to the bathing palace where female eunuchs washed and perfumed her. They didn't dress her afterward. Instead, they wrapped her in a silk blanket, leaving only her face visible. The reason appears in training manuals with bureaucratic clarity. A clothed woman can hide weapons. A wrapped woman cannot. 2 eunuchs carried her to the imperial bedchamber and placed her at the foot of the emperor's bed. She had to crawl forward without using her hands, without raising her eyes, without speaking unless spoken to. A chief eunuch remained in the room throughout the encounter, standing behind a screen, but present and watching. His job was to keep time. After precisely 30 minutes, he announced loudly, "Time to preserve the golden essence of the Son of Heaven." The emperor had to conclude immediately. If he didn't, the eunuch would enter and physically remove the concubine. After the encounter, an imperial physician examined the woman and recorded every detail in medical logs that were sealed and stored. The purpose was evidentiary. If she became pregnant, there needed to be absolute documented proof the child was the emperor's. The logs were detailed enough to be grotesque. They recorded physical observations. They noted the emperor's mood. They tracked cycles and patterns with the same clinical precision used for tracking grain harvests. But here's what made this system truly perverse beyond the obvious violation. Most concubines were never summoned, not once, not ever. During the height of the Ming dynasty, the imperial harem contained between 600 and 1,000 women at any given time. The emperor might summon 1 or 2 per week. The mathematics are simple and devastating. A concubine could spend her entire life, 30 or 40 years, waiting for a call that would never come. She would age in silence, watching younger girls arrive in waves every 3 years. Knowing her purpose, the only reason she had been taken from her family would never be fulfilled. And yet she couldn't leave, couldn't marry, couldn't have children with anyone else. She was property in permanent storage, maintained and catalogued, but never used, and the system saw nothing wrong with this because concubines weren't classified as people under imperial law. They were listed in the same bureaucratic category as porcelain vases and jade ornaments, precious objects, breakable, replaceable. The women turned on each other because the system gave them no other outlet. With hundreds of women competing for the attention of one man, with pregnancy being the only route to security and status, the harem became an arena where psychological warfare ran constantly beneath the surface of formal etiquette. Concubines poisoned each other's food. They bribed eunuchs to remove rivals from the selection tablets. They spread rumors designed to make other women fall from imperial favor. Palace records document cases of women slipping abortifacient herbs into pregnant rivals' tea. If the pregnancy terminated, the rival's position collapsed. If she died from complications, even better. The murders were rarely investigated because the system didn't care. There were always more women. The most famous case involved Empress Wu Zetian, one of the only women to rule China in her own name. Historical accounts, disputed but persistent, claim she strangled her own newborn daughter and blamed a rival concubine for the death. The rival was executed. Wu rose to become empress and eventually emperor. Whether the story is literally true matters less than the fact that it was believable to contemporaries, that everyone in the palace understood this kind of calculation was possible, even likely. The culture of the harem made mothers into murderers and friends into enemies because survival required it. Women who had been kidnapped, trained, and dehumanized learned to do the same to others because the alternative was being destroyed first. And if a concubine somehow survived the warfare, somehow caught the emperor's attention, somehow became pregnant, that's when the nightmare deepened in ways most people don't expect. Getting pregnant was supposed to be the goal. It was supposed to mean security, elevation, purpose. But for low-ranking concubines, pregnancy often meant something closer to a death sentence, just slower. A pregnant concubine was immediately isolated in remote palace buildings under constant surveillance. She couldn't receive visitors, couldn't send messages, couldn't walk in the gardens. The stated reason was protecting the imperial bloodline. The actual function was preventing any possibility of the woman forming alliances or gaining power through her pregnancy. When the child was born, it was taken from her immediately. If it was a boy, he was handed to wet nurses and raised in separate quarters. The biological mother might see him once or twice a year, always supervised, never allowed to touch him without permission. The child would grow up not knowing her as mother, but as another palace woman whose name he might not remember. If the child was a girl, the outcome was often worse. Imperial records from the Ming dynasty contain meticulous documentation of princes' births, educations, and positions, but daughters of low-ranking concubines often simply don't appear in the records at all. They existed, they were born, and then the documentation stops. What happened to them isn't explicitly stated, but palace expenditure logs show no corresponding increases in female servants or marriage arrangements. The implications are clear enough that historians don't usually spell them out in academic papers. Some concubines understood this. Records describe women consuming abortifacient herbs in secret, risking death from hemorrhage or infection, rather than bringing a daughter into the system that had destroyed them. The choice wasn't between life and death. It was between different kinds of death, and some women chose the faster option. Han lived through all of this. She survived the selection, the training, the hierarchy, the isolation. She was never summoned by Emperor Yongle, which meant she remained low-ranking, which meant she lived in a 10-by-10-foot room with 2 other women and ate food that was often spoiled by the time it reached her level. And then in 1421, something happened that would define the last 3 years of her life and demonstrate just how disposable the system considered these women to be. One of the emperor's favorite consorts was found dead. The official record states she was poisoned, but rumors spread through the palace with the speed of fire. Rumors that said she had taken her own life after an affair with a palace eunuch was discovered, and that the real scandal wasn't the affair but what it revealed about the emperor's declining virility. Yongle was in his 60s, increasingly paranoid, increasingly concerned with legacy and image. The rumor, true or not, humiliated him. His response was methodical and absolute. He ordered an investigation, but he wasn't seeking truth. He was seeking silence. In a single night, 2,800 women were executed. Not just concubines, but servants, cooks, laundresses, musicians, any woman who worked in the palace complex and might have heard the rumor, might have known something, might have talked. The method was linky, death by 1,000 cuts, a form of execution designed to maximize suffering and serve as deterrent. The executioners were given explicit orders to prolong the process. Some women took hours to die. The screaming echoed through the palace complex from midnight until dawn. Girls as young as 12 were included. Women in their 60s who had served the palace for decades. Pregnant concubines. It didn't matter. The criteria wasn't guilt or innocence. It was potential knowledge. By morning, the courtyards had to be washed with bucket after bucket of water drawn from the palace wells, the same wells that in later decades would become the most common method of suicide for women who couldn't escape the system any other way. There is no official record of this massacre in Ming Dynasty documents because the court erased it deliberately. But one account survived because one woman survived long enough to speak. Her name was Lady Han, a mid-ranking concubine who happened to be outside the palace that night, visiting a sick relative with rare permission, and by a simple accident of timing, she escaped the purge. Years later, she dictated her testimony to a Korean diplomatic envoy, describing screams that lasted until dawn, the unnatural silence that followed, eunuchs dragging bodies through corridors she had walked every day, and courtyards slick with blood that took days to wash away. She named women she had trained with, eaten with, lived beside, and her testimony endured only because it was preserved in Korean archives, beyond the reach of Ming censors, making it one of the only first-hand accounts of what the palace later whispered about, but never recorded. Han survived that night because she was considered insignificant, but her survival lasted only 3 more years. When Emperor Yongle died in 1424, the practice of zunzang accompanying burial was still fully enforced, and the new emperor ordered the selection of women to follow his father into death, usually between 5 and 30, with Han among them. The criteria were never officially written, but the pattern is clear. Women favored enough to be remembered, yet expendable enough to be sacrificed. 3 days after the emperor's death, the chosen women were informed, moved to special quarters, and given a final meal of rich food and forbidden wine, sometimes with music playing as if it were a celebration, before being offered 2 so-called choices. They could hang themselves using white silk cords, considered an honorable death that brought rewards to their families, or they could refuse, in which case eunuchs would hang them by force or drug them until they lost consciousness, with the outcome unchanged. Their bodies, some possibly still breathing, were dressed in ceremonial robes and seated in chambers around the tomb as if still attending their emperor before the tomb was sealed. Archaeology confirms this reality. When an imperial tomb was opened in 1958, 16 women were found seated, most showing signs of hanging, while 3 bore fractured wrists and scratch marks on stone walls, evidence they had struggled, and that the walls remembered what the records denied. Han was 32 when she was given the white silk. After 16 years inside the Forbidden City, never once summoned by the emperor and with a single denied petition to return home to her mother, and whether she accepted or resisted is unknown, her name appearing only on a burial list placed closest to the emperor's sarcophagus, close to power even in death. Today millions walk these courtyards and admire the architecture, unaware that some buildings have no plaques, some wells are sealed, and some walls required deeper restoration for reasons stone alone cannot explain, because the Forbidden City does not speak, but it remembers.